Free speech, why the philosophy matters. Let's start by thinking about what a meaningful life requires. So we human beings are smart beings, or we're potentially smart, but we're not instinctual creatures or passive creatures. For us to make a go of our lives, it requires a lot of active engagement with the world and really deep thinking. We have to formulate our life goals. We have to formulate a strategy for realizing our goals. All of that requires lots of information, lots of experimenting, and it is a do-it-yourself project. If we extend that to meaningful relationships and social values, for our relationships to be meaningful, we have to find and discover that we have shared values. Now, there are degrees of intimacy from business acquaintances, friends, lovers, like partners, and so on. But in common, all of those relationships to be valuable and meaningful, they depend on exchanges of information, genuine communication. All of that has to happen within a context of trust that has to be created, a context of respect that also has to be created and earned, and above all, freedom. We have to be able to enter into relationships by our choice and exit those relationships when they're just not working out. Even if they are going to work out, disagreements are going to arise, so we have to have a context in which there's at least an initial benefit of the doubt, and we know that we're going to give and get that. A willingness to hear out the other side, nuanced judgment that before we condemn someone or blame them or excuse them, that we take all of the available information into account. Now, all of that about the cognitive demands of human beings, we are smart, and if we're going to think deeply about our lives and all of our important values, that's a complicated process, and that's a major part of what education should instill in us. I think that's precisely why we now have deep concerns over current educational and broadly intellectual culture trends, where the opposite of everything I just said seems to be on the rise, an increase in the amount of distrust, an increase in disrespect, and in some cases explicit attacks on freedom. Now, the standard old-fashioned threats are still there nationwide and worldwide. There are plenty of traditional authoritarian forces. Often they're on the so-called conservative side or the so-called right end of some spectrum. And plenty of those people are willing to intimidate and suppress and override free speech. But it does seem that we have a new generational threat that this time is coming especially from the authoritarian left. And there's a question about why that is. Now, talking about authoritarian left and authoritarian right, I do want to flag at the outset one theme of this series in the Open College podcast series, that almost always on important issues, applied and philosophical, there are three positions that need to be taken into account, not two. That we always have to be wary of binaries. Now, there are important political binaries, religious binaries, philosophical binaries, but they are a small number, and the false alternatives that we're typically presented with outnumber them by a big margin, and they do come in many forms. Now, depending where you are in the world right now, the worst threats to you might be coming from more right-wing, conservative, authoritarian ideologies, or if you're in a different part of the world or a different institutional context, they might be coming from left-wing authoritarians. And it's often worth pointing out, however right and left authoritarians might seem to be opposed to each other, they almost always share some more basic common premises that put both of them in opposition to genuine liberals. And those of us who are genuine liberals are often irritated that we're sometimes forced to, it seems, or given options where we're only allowed to choose between some sort of right-wing-ism or some sort of left-wing-ism. Now, if we look at the debates in speech, we can see this pattern because the false alternative comes at us in many philosophical forms. So we might look at the philosophical grounding for authoritarians on the right and the left. Typically conservatives, if they're very strong, religious conservatives will say we need metaphysically to appeal to some higher truths. perhaps to some divine revelations. And some people and some institutions have special access to those higher truths, and that gives them the right to impose their truths on the rest of us. Now, metaphysically, people at the far left end of the authoritarian spectrum will say, no, we don't believe in any of that nonsense. What we call reality just is this subjectively, socially created context of belief. But you'll always find them also arguing that some individuals are specially woke, right? Or they've been trained in critical theory, and as a result, they have special insight into what's really going on. And that wokeness and special training gives them the right authoritarianly to impose their beliefs on the rest of us. So even though in this case it seems like the far right and the far left have different and opposed metaphysics, both of those metaphysics are used against those who favor liberal approaches to speech and communication. Now, the argument might be over human nature, and again, the far right and the far left have different accounts here. Some very strong religious accounts of human nature believe in a collective sin, collective responsibility for sin, and a notion of collective salvation, that we all need to unite together and face our Creator or the ultimate judge of the universe. That means that deviants, right, or individuals, right, who disbelieve or challenge are undermining the salvation of the group, and so they need to be dealt with. Now, if we go to the other end of the spectrum, the far left end of the spectrum, there we will often see non-collective salvation notions, but nonetheless a collective identity and an argument that what human beings need is solidarity with their groups. So if you then are a dissenter and you challenge, right, the dominant beliefs of some collective identity, you will then be labeled a race traitor, or in the case of gender and sex issues, if you're a woman who deviates from some forms of feminist lines, you're betraying false consciousness and you're sabotaging the cause of women everywhere. So again, there's a collectivism that underlies the willingness to impose on individuals who deviate just on this theme of what it is to be a human being, even though far right and far left seem to have very different understandings of what that is. Or if we look just more specifically at ethical issues, where do we get our moral values from and what status do those have? We will often, if we go to the far right conservative end of the spectrum, say that there are certain moral values that are just beyond question. These are absolute religious truths that we should just accept. And therefore, it's unconscionable blasphemy to challenge any of those beliefs. And we know how we should be dealing with blasphemers. But then if we go to the far end of the authoritarian left end of the spectrum, they also will say there are certain moral values that are just absolutely beyond question. We'll put them under the label of social justice, which functions as an axiomatic set of beliefs, and it's just unconscionable hate speech for anybody to challenge those in any fundamental way. Now, the point is that the far left and the far right, if we could use those labels now, they will disagree metaphysically about human nature, disagree about ethics, but nonetheless, when the rubber meets the road, all of them are denying the individual's need and the responsibility to evaluate the facts of the world and what values they're going to adopt as an individual using his or her own judgment. Now, I'm reminded here of the poet Walt Whitman, who was a genuine liberal. And I like this quotation where he advised this quote. This is from his Leaves of Grass. "Re-examine all you have been told at church or school or in any book. Dismiss whatever insults your own soul." Your own soul, that is your own individual judgment. And notice he's saying you're not necessarily going to reject. So the idea is that we can't learn from people on the left or learn from people on the right or learn from whoever the current authorities are in our generation. But the important point is each of us as individuals needs to re-examine what's presented to us and see it for ourselves and see it with our own eyes. Now, liberalism, in the Walt Whitman spirit, has often been challenged by the authoritarian right, but it does now seem in Western academic and intellectual life much more that the challenge to genuine liberalism is coming from the authoritarian left. And that raises a question. Why is that? Let me try out a cheap answer. The left, especially the far left, lost a lot of debates over the 20th century. The left does bill itself as being primarily concerned with poverty, with racism, with sexism, broadly equality issues can be lumped under that. And they have a particular understanding of what causes poverty, racism, and sexism, and a set of recommendations for how we are supposed to solve them. So we've been having huge debates over poverty, racism, and sexism, debates more specifically in economic theory and practice, and most of us are well aware of the huge debates over affirmative action as a potential tool for overcoming racism, sexism, and so on. But the fact is, in the 20th century and on into the 21st century, actually earlier than that, starting in the Age of Enlightenment, we have made astoundingly great progress in combating poverty, sexism, and racism. But it's not because we've adopted any of the communistic or socialistic or far left proposed solutions, or because we've implemented vigorous affirmative action programs. Instead, the credit for the achievements that we've made in combating poverty and all of those negative isms goes to the genuinely liberal and free market capitalist philosophies, the ones that have emphasized entrepreneurial achievement, respect for individual merit, and individual freedom. It's precisely to the extent that those views have been adopted that we have gotten rid of the old-fashioned problems. So the credit does not go to far-left ideologies. Communism and socialism, they've been failures everywhere they've tried. Affirmative action has been pretty widely rejected, even though we give it a respectful hearing and look at its debates. But one thing that we do know about people who are ideologists primarily is that when one loses a debate, it's tempting to try to change the terms that underlie that debate. So, for example, if you're losing at chess, in your frustration, you knock over the board, right? Or you claim that the rules of chess are biased or unfair. Now, that might be a cheap answer, but I think it does capture part of the explanation that the far left knows that it's lost a lot of debates, but nonetheless is not rejecting its own ideology or engaging in serious self-examination. Instead, it doubles down on a losing ideology and simply adopts more ruthless tactics. And that's part of what's going on. Now, I think that's an explanation of lesser importance. And it's of lesser importance because over the last two generations, the authoritarian left has won another debate, a philosophical debate over the nature of knowledge, truth, language, and power. That takes us into serious philosophical territory. And the claim I'm going to make is that the left has lost some debates, some very significant debates in politics, economics, social philosophy, more broadly speaking, but it does have some powerful philosophical tools on its side, and those need to be looked at. So how did we get where we are now? Now, our modern liberal education context did come out of some debates in the early modern world. So part of what the authoritarian left, or the authoritarian-leaning left, is currently reacting to is a liberal education context that itself is a reaction to an early conservative or far-right authoritarian, as we would now describe it, context. Now, the highlights, rather, of that debate are embodied in all of the famous names that we associate with free thinking. These are the deep thinkers, in many cases courageous individuals who carved out the philosophical space, the intellectual space within which what we call the modern liberal education ideal came into existence. So we hearken back to someone like Galileo Galilei, maturely working in science and in philosophy of science in the early 1600s. And what's important to remember in Galileo's context is that when he was a younger intellectual, Giordano Bruno had been found guilty of heresy and killed killed legally by the Inquisition and with the authority of the Catholic Church behind him for advocating what were seen as heretical scientific theories. Now, Galileo was cautioned by this, as were thousands and thousands of other intellectuals right around the world. We don't want to, given that the church is currently, this is prior to separation of church and state, the church is currently a political force as well as being a social force, a moral force, and an institutionally religious force. So we have to be careful. But what Galileo is important for on this particular debate is his willingness to stand up and say, if we are genuinely interested in the truth, the important thing is that individuals need to use their own reason, not simply to consult old books that have been handed down through tradition and that certain authoritative institutions claim a monopoly on interpretation. Now, Galileo is going to argue as a good Catholic. He's going to argue that Scripture is authoritative as long as it stays in its proper zone, and that the clergy and the theologians who are being trained in the authoritative institutions do have an expertise that needs to be respected and so forth. But Galileo's argument is that God gave each individual human being sense organs, the capacity to perceive the world, the capacity to think about the world, and that what God wants us to do is to use our minds to understand not only the book of Scripture, but also the book of nature. God wrote 2 books, and those books have slightly different rhetorical purposes, sometimes significantly different audiences in mind that they're trying to achieve. But people who are using their minds to do experiments, to observe the natural world, and to reason on the basis of it are not being anti-religious in doing so. And so what we need to do is understand that God wants us to study the natural world using our God-given intellectual talents to do so, and that it in fact is a form of heresy or a form of blasphemy if we start to use authoritative institutional intimidation methods to try to get people unthinkingly to accept a certain interpretation of how the world works. Now, we know that Galileo, over the course of a couple of decades, was in a very awkward position, but had the courage to argue back against what was then the most powerful institution in the Western world. And while eventually he was silenced, nonetheless, the arguments that he made did prevail and provided intellectual ammunition for a generation or two of intellectual freethinkers and scientists to go on and do the kind of work. So what Galileo is arguing is that the individual, each of us, has the capacity to observe the world and think for ourselves, and this is fundamentally a responsibility that we all bear. Now, another contemporary of Galileo's is the English thinker Francis Bacon. Bacon agrees broadly with the spirit of Galileo's empirical and rational philosophy, but the importance of Bacon in this context is that reason is not only a capacity for studying the world, it's a capacity that in the first place has to be trained, and each of us, if we are going to be properly educated, needs to take on a responsibility of training our own minds, and that we always are, given the way our minds work psychologically, tempted to engage in certain shortcuts, that we are sometimes willing to take our own narrow experience and generalize inappropriately from it. Or we're interested in taking shortcuts in the form of letting our peer groups or the weight of authority say, well, lots of people seem to think this, or various authoritative institutions seem to think this, so I will accept it. And that's a shortcut as well. So all of us are always going to be fighting against what he calls these idols that are built into perhaps our psychological framework, but each of us and our proper self-education and training our minds to be the effective tools that they can be needs to take on this battle of crafting our rational capacity into having the ability to figure out the truths as they really are. So, combining Galileo with Bacon, we get the idea that yes, experience and reason are important and able to understand the world, but experience and reason as psychological capacities themselves need vigilantly to be trained, and we always need to be on the guard against creeping bias in our own thinking if we are going to, as individuals, achieve this. In the next generation, John Locke extends this to social things. If we are going to genuinely take the quest for truth seriously, and we recognize that each individual has the capacity and the responsibility for seeking the truth and figuring out what really is good in the world, then necessarily socially this is going to require that we are tolerant, because the world is complicated, and we know if we leave it up to individuals to go off and explore the world intellectually on their own, they're going to come up with lots of different hypotheses. They're going to make commitments to all sorts of different kinds of beliefs. And if the important point is individual responsibility and the individual judgment of truth, then socially we each have to respect the fact that the other person's has a right to differ in their beliefs. We don't have to respect their belief, but we do have to respect their right to have that belief and to follow their own path. And that means institutionally and socially, we should have a very deep respect for intellectual diversity. And we need to institutionalize that both in ourselves and the institutions that we create. John Stuart Mill, jumping a century and a half or so, another great liberal thinker, extends this argument, I think, even further. And my understanding of Mill's unique contribution to this is to say Locke is right, Bacon is right, but Galileo is right in all of those points. But we need to have on the social side the view that other people, even when they disagree with us, they might be our intellectual rivals. But in addition to seeing them as intellectual rivals, we should not merely tolerate them, but actively seek out their different views, because our seeking out their different views benefits us, because we might be smart individuals, we might have thought a lot about various things, but chances are good that we have not thought of everything, and we might have not the best arguments for the beliefs that we hold, even if our beliefs turn out to be true. So the only way we're going to find this out is by putting our beliefs to the test. That is to say, giving the other side or the other sides of the debate a fair hearing. And what we might find is that, in fact, they have some part of the truth packaged into their belief system. I don't accept their belief system maybe overall, but there are some elements of truth that they are emphasizing, and their emphasizing them will highlight to me things that I might have overlooked and therefore need to incorporate into my own belief system. And of course, what their criticism of my current belief system will do for me is point out any weaknesses that it currently has, and that can only strengthen me. So, in addition to tolerating widespread beliefs, I should actively seek out diversity of opinions and test my beliefs against them, and that is a socially win-win process. Now, that model, integrating the Galileo position about the importance of reason and experiment, Bacon's point about the importance of each of us taking on our own psychological biases and temptations to take shortcuts, Locke's emphasis on diversity and social tolerance, and Will seeing the clash of ideas as a socially win-win process that we should all embrace, all of that integrated came to form what we consider the modern liberal education context. And that is to say, liberal education is about the pursuit of truth, but it's about the rational pursuit of truth. This is a responsibility that each individual bears, and that the only way an individual can get self-respect and proper social dignity is by engaging in this process to the best of his or her ability, and that social respect and social benevolence should be built into the process in order to make it work, not only for each of us as individuals, but for our societies more broadly. Now, that model prevailed after the course of many generations, in some cases many centuries of battle, tooth and nail battles against traditional conservative forces, and I mean literally tooth and nail, as many early liberal thinkers did have their teeth and nails yanked out under torture, and it became our modern liberal education context. Embodied in that conception of liberal education is a philosophical view about the nature of language. Language as a tool of cognition and communication. But that epistemological and linguistic theory about what language is and how it works and what makes it valuable is itself subject to philosophical controversy. Now, in my own thinking, this portion I subhead it, free speech is free thought, is free action. So there's an integration between speech, thought, and action. And that's a rhetorical overstatement, but I'm using it in my own thinking for rhetorical purposes to highlight the importance of the integration of thought with speech, with action. And that's a philosophically charged set of claims. So when we get to free speech debates, it's going to be important when we talk about cognition and communication that we see the language, right, that is the vehicle that we use for cognition and communication, be primarily individual in nature. That's one point to stress, and that the language requires a kind of integration between abstract theory and particular practice. The way human cognition works is by a very complex interaction of abstract and particular processes, as well as theoretical and applied processes. So this takes us into some deep territory, but this is particularly by the time we get to far left, and particularly postmodern left, attacks on free speech, where the real battleground is. First, focus on the individuality. Now, typically, and for very good reasons, defenses of free speech will emphasize the social aspect. So, John Locke and the followers of Locke will emphasize that free speech is important in part because trying to oppress free speech is completely useless. Free speech, when it is suppressed, doesn't really change anybody's mind. Instead, people just secretly go on believing whatever it is that they're going to believe. They might mouth the appropriate words if the authorities force them to do so, but that doesn't change anyone's mind. So political authoritarianism of any sort really is kind of useless. John Stuart Mill is emphasizing the social needs of learning, that we really have to understand and hear from the intellectual opposition. Otherwise, even if we believe true things, we only have a second best or third rate understanding of why those things are true. Now, it is true that free speech is an important social need, and it is one that should have, in my judgment, absolute political protection. But the important thing here is that it is a need of individual minds. Right? And the reason for that is because thinking requires integration. We have to think. We have to externalize our thinking in speech. We have to be able to externalize our thinking and our speech in action, try things out in the world, and we also have to take the results of our trying things out in the world as data that feeds back into our thinking. So there is no way, if we're genuinely interested in human cognition, to isolate speech as some sort of secret thing that goes on in the privacy of your own mind and has no implications in the world. Free speech does require speech. It requires action. So there's a robust set of rights that needs to be respected and implemented here. So if we take language, right, for example, and I want to emphasize the individuality of language. Now, it is a common thesis that language is a social product. The argument, is true in one sense. Language is importantly social, but it is not primarily social. And it's true that language exists before any one of us is born. So we're born into a language culture. It's all true that we're taught language in a social context, usually first from our parents. But despite those two facts, language is primarily an individual function. So here I sometimes think in terms of an analogy to riding a bicycle, or the biking analogy as I think of it. Now, it's true that bikes were made by other people long before any of us are born. It's also true that when you learn to ride a bike, it's almost always because you are taught to use that bike by others. Maybe you just see other people riding a bike and they inspire you to go ahead and try so. Maybe it's more hands-on with your mom or dad or an older sibling. They will model it for you and assist you and encourage you. But the important thing about bike riding is that it is something that you do yourself, and it is for yourself. Bike riding happens when you, as an individual, make a commitment to it. You have to let go of any supports that are around you. You have to push off from the ground by yourself. You have to press the pedals. You have to steer the bike yourself, and you have to go in a direction that you have chosen. The same thing holds with language, is the argument that I am making here. Like a bicycle, language is a tool, but we use it ourselves as individuals primarily. We have to initiate the process. We have to use the language to guide our thinking, to take it in the direction that we want to go. So we have to push and steer the language in the direction that we want to go. So that's the individuality of the process. It's primarily something that individuals use as a tool to understand the world for themselves. When they are engaging in communication acts, right, the individual has to initiate the language. The person who's on the receiving of the language has to initiate the process of listening or reading or interpreting the sign language if it's that way, and processing it in his or her individual mind. Even the social element and the social use of language requires the individual functioning of the two minds that are involved. Secondly, I want to emphasize a point about integration, that free speech is based on needs of cognition. That cognition can only happen, that might be a bit strong, can best happen in a context where free speech is the operative social principle. Now, each one of us has this happy responsibility of developing our minds, keeping our minds fit, keeping our minds healthy, just as we have the same responsibility of keeping our bodies fit, keeping our bodies healthy. But the way our minds work, and as far as we know, much of this is distinctive to human cognition, is by a complicated interplay of particular elements and abstractions that we form by a process of concept formation. So we do have a very powerful mind that enables us to put things into abstract categories, but if we get very abstract and we never tie our abstractions back to the particulars, then it's easy, as we think of it, to get lost in thought, or for our thought to become overly rationalistically and lose any actual connection to concrete particular reality. So what thinking requires, even abstract thinking, is a connecting to particulars, particular entities in the world, the particular concretes that give rise to them and again give them meaning. Now, a second and closely related point is that when we are thinking, we do have a powerful mind, but there is so much or only so much that we can hold in our minds at any given time. Sometimes this is given the nickname of the crow epistemology, because crows' minds, when they were studied, they had a limited number of particular entities that the crows could attend to at a given point. And the same thing is true of human beings. If we just attend to particular objects or particular mental entities that we are considering, we can only hold so many of them in our time, perhaps 5, 6, or 7 if we are concentrating very hard. But reality is complicated, and oftentimes we need a way to keep track of more than 5, 6, or 7 things. So we need memory tools and memory aids so that we can, in terms of the things that we're actively considering, nonetheless have the other objects that we need to attend to within cognitive grasp easily enough, some sort of a memory aid. Third thing is that much of our thinking requires that we integrate what we are considering currently with our background knowledge, and all of us will have thousands and thousands of items of background knowledge that we also want to recall and have available to us to consult when we are thinking about whatever particular things that we are doing right now. And that means that we need to have long-term memory aids, books, for examples, right, or hard drives where we have stored information that we can call up lots and lots of information when we need it. A fourth thing is that we need, when we are thinking, actually to try out objects of knowledge, hypotheses that we are considering, for example, in the real world. Sometimes the only way we can, and often rather, the only way we can figure out whether something really is true or whether it's really reliable is by doing experimenting. And experimenting is a form of acting in the world. So cognition requires experimenting, right? There's no way that we can all just retreat to our philosophers' armchairs. Actually, that gives philosophers a bad reputation, but sometimes it's true as a cliche, I know, but that we can turn out the world and without actually engaging with the world experimentally figure out the truth about the world. It's just not possible. Now, what this means is that if we are interested in thinking, and of course we are interested in thinking, thinking is the only way we can get truth, the only way we can figure out what's good, what's important, what's reasonable, what's probabilistic, and so forth, is that our thinking requires embodiment. It has to be embodied in concrete language, in words, in spoken words, in written words. That is to say, free thought requires the freedom to externalize our thoughts in a particular form, in speech or in text or by means of signing. If we're not allowed to do that, then our cognitive ability is dramatically impaired. It also means that our thinking requires freedom of action. We have to be able to go out into the world and try out our ideas to see which ones work. That means we need a lot of trial and error. Sometimes the trial and error is a matter of debating with other people to put our ideas to a social test, or experimenting in physical reality. That is to say, both of them are kinds of action. So the point that I'm making here is to say that both individually and socially, freedom of thought does not exist only as some isolated, abstracted, disconnected thing from speech, from action, from the rest of the world. Rather, freedom of thought necessarily includes, if it's to be effective, freedom of speech, freedom of the press socially, and the liberty of action. Now, that point that I'm stressing here is about epistemology and about language, but what we should find is that my individualistic point here is that if we get philosophies that are fundamentally not individualistic, or that in some deep way they separate the needs of thought from the needs of speech, from the needs of action, from the needs of concretization, that what we'll find is those deep philosophies will also end up not seeing the importance of free speech, and sometimes they will act actively to oppose it. To say that free speech is free thought, is free action, is a rhetorical overstatement, but its purpose is to emphasize the integration of thought, speech, and action. Of course, we can think in limited ways without speaking. We can act semi-successfully in the world without engaging in fresh thinking. But fully successful human living is this ongoing process of free action guided by free thinking. And that thinking, in turn, has to be informed by the results of that action. Now, this leads us directly to the responsibility of teachers and professors and parents concerned with raising their children. Our responsibility when we take on that role is ourselves, of course, to be genuine seekers of truth, goodness, and beauty. And in turn, we are guiding and mentoring others, typically younger people, in their own seeking of truth, goodness, and beauty. So what we want, then, is for those others whom we are teaching to consider lots and lots of ideas, to read widely, to feel free and welcome even to express their own half-formed opinions, to enter into debates, to question other people's ideas, to be open to having their own ideas criticized, to actively try out their ideas, to do formal experiments, because we think that's the only way to get to the truth. The individual engaging in observation, experimenting, and reasoning in an integrated fashion. Now, we're all familiar with those people, unfortunately, who discourage some or all of those activities, people who are indoctrinators. They have their agenda, they have their beliefs, they have their so-called truths. When they get positions of authority, they use that power in totally irresponsible ways. They give biased educations or biased presentations, one-sided presentations on issues that they know are controversial and that there are very good viewpoints on other sides out there, or who engage in some sort of intellectual, social, or even political intimidation. In my view, those people are intellectual cowards, and at a minimum, they are abusers of their power. Good teachers inform, they model, they coach. But we do face now, in the recent generation, some newer enemies of free speech. They're not just old-fashioned indoctrinators, and they are precisely those who do not believe in the individual. They believe in group identities, and they typically believe that the individuals who are in those groups are shaped by group forces beyond the individual's control. They are also those who don't believe in truth or reason, those who put those words in scare quotes when they use them. That is to say, they are committed to some sort of very deep skepticism. And that is precisely the postmodern left, and it's the postmodern left that's at the root of most of the contemporary attacks from the left on free speech in intellectual life. They are the ones more demographically than anyone else who are currently willing to use intimidation and or outright forceful methods to advance their particular group's beliefs and values. Now, the point of this podcast is to point up the fact that the debate is philosophical. It's not primarily political. It's not primarily economic or some other social dimension. Just as liberal free speech required a philosophical defense against traditional conservative kinds of authoritarianisms in the late medieval and early modern era, in contemporary times it requires one against contemporary postmodern leftists. A historical reminder, we do live in a very successful culture. We have many admirable things to celebrate and to enjoy. Part of good life is being able simply to take for granted that you're living in a successful culture and get on with the business of enjoying everything that it makes possible to you. But it's also important to remember that there have been other successful cultures in the past that failed. And in some cases, they failed precisely for the issues that we are concerned with now. A failure widespread to respect the free speech of important individuals and free speech more broadly in any individual's life. So we think of the examples of Socrates, where Socrates was precisely a martyr for philosophical thinking. But Socrates wasn't an isolated example. The pre-Socratic philosopher, the generation earlier, Anaximander, had been exiled from Athens for daring to suggest that the sun was not a god, but rather just a big rock up in the sky that was on fire. Imagine that. But Anaximander, a generation later, Socrates, and it's important to remember that a generation and a half later, Aristotle, as tensions once again arose in Athens over various politically charged issues, Aristotle decided to leave Athens on the grounds that, as he put it, he did not want the hot-tempered, politicized elements to commit another sin against philosophy. And it's not an accident that Greece's golden age was ending precisely in the era of Aristotle, and that Greece was weakened, and its weakening was one of the reasons why it was able to be conquered successfully by the Romans. Now, if we jump to the early modern era, the late feudal era, the case of Galileo is, of course, important, and there are any number of other individuals like Michael Servetus and Giordano Bruno who were martyred and killed by religious authoritarians and other forms of conservative, really anti-intellectual authoritarians that wanted to suppress free speech in his time, and they did succeed in silencing Galileo for the last decade of his life. But it's also important to realize that that sent signals to lots of other important intellectuals. I'm thinking here of René Descartes, another philosophical genius, who early in his life decided that he was going to get out of Southern Europe, where the repressions were the worst, and move north to Northern Europe, where there was a greater degree of intellectual tolerance. And again, it's not a historical accident that Italy, especially tragically for Italy, which had been the seat of the Renaissance and had spawned a whole generation of university building and attracted the best minds from all over Europe to its universities, that in the generation of and after Galileo, right, once the message of his silencing spread, Italy declined to second-rate status and then eventually to third-rate status. And it was precisely in England and the Netherlands and other places in the northwest of Europe that had more free speech, liberal intellectual environments. And, of course, the lessons just of the last 100 years, one can make, of course, the argument that Germany was an amazing powerhouse intellectual culture, 19th century, early 20th century. But with the rise of National Socialism and the rise of communism there, it's always important to remember that Marxism was a German export. But as those kinds of intellectual and political authoritarianisms rose to social prominence there, intellectual life in the nations thereby affected also slowed down and silenced as thousands and thousands of very bright free thinkers from all parts of the intellectual spectrum got out of Germany, got out of Austria, got out of Russia, and went to the West by and large, where liberal free speech was respected and practiced. So the lessons of history are quite clear. The only way we're going to have a vigorous progressive culture is by lots of individuals who are creative and brilliant. And the only way we're going to have a culture in which individuals are free to put together a happy life as they see fit is by giving people lots of scope for thinking for themselves, deciding their own values, and doing their own experimenting in an atmosphere of intellectual and social tolerance and in an atmosphere of social benevolence where we actively embrace the collision sometimes of ideas to figure out which ones really are best. Any practice of intimidation, self-exiling, and outright killing obviously kills the cultures that have achieved some measure of greatness. Now, we have a great but a flawed civilizations, but let's make sure for our own sakes, for the sake of our own individual selves, as well for our mutual benefit, that we don't repeat the dramatic mistakes of history. We have to learn what made us possible, or possible for us to create a great civilization in the first place. And my answer is good philosophy.